Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Our moderator is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy, host of Securing America TV, and Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China. Now let's get started. Frank.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. It is on a topic that will be perhaps shocking to some of you, but it is vitally important that you be aware of something that, in a way, this recent series of, well, I can only call them spectacles, with at least one high-altitude surveillance balloon launched at the United States by the Chinese Communist Party has put in relief, high relief, one might say. That is that the Chinese seem to be particularly interested in surveilling at relatively close hand, certainly far closer than their satellites would permit them to observe, the intercontinental ballistic missile fields of the United States, all three of them. What they were interested in, what they were collecting, and what they mean to do about is a set of interesting topics. We're going to put them into a larger context, however, specifically involving the question of whether or not they may shed light on the Chinese Communist Party's thinking on the subject of whether it can wage and win a nuclear war against the United States. We've assembled for the purpose three, I believe, of our country's most distinguished, thoughtful, knowledgeable, and accurate analysts of these sorts of threats, whether it's from the Chinese Communist Party or the Russians with whom they are partnered, which, as we will discuss, adds further to the risks of a nuclear war, because we may face not one, but two nuclear-armed powers waging it against us. The first of our speakers, I'm very pleased to say, was with us just last week and has contributed frequently to these programs. He is really one of our country's preeminent authorities on the Chinese military. Indeed, he is the author of a book on that very subject, China's Military Modernization, Building for Regional and Global Reach. His name is Richard Fisher. He is these days a senior fellow for Asia at the Institute for Assessment and Strategy, and a very, very well prized member of our Committee on the Present Danger China. We've asked Rick to set the stage for this conversation by talking about a subject that he's studied closely, namely the extent to which the Chinese have built and are still amassing a very formidable nuclear arsenal, far larger than it has been thought to be in the past, and probably just a fraction of what it may be very shortly. With that, Rick Fisher, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know you have to shoot and scoot, but we're delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours, sir.
Frank, thank you very much for inviting me on this session, and I would just add that it's a special honor to be joined by Dr. Mark Schneider and Phil Carver, both of whom I often refer to as national treasures of strategic clarity. They did so much to help win the last Cold War, and we are very fortunate that they are with us to help fight the next one, which we have been in for really some time. I'd like to start by commenting on the recent aerial Valentine that the United States received from Hainan Island. Yes, the administration has revealed that the balloon that traversed the United States was launched from Hainan Island. This is very, very important. Hainan Island is one of the most crucial strategic intersections for the People's Liberation Army. It is a base for the majority of the People's Liberation Army navies, Type 094, Type 094A, strategic nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, which we've been informed by the Navy in the last 5 months, have all been upgraded with the new JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile that can reach targets in the United States from locations much closer to Hainan Island, meaning that they're not going to be as vulnerable to American attack submarines. This is also very important. And this balloon, flying first from Hainan, it was aimed at Guam, and then the administration revealed, or at least intelligence sources were quoted, saying that the balloon was then mistakenly blown off course. It was gathered by high altitude winds and sent on its journey across Alaska and then the United States. This was not a mistake. If it was a mistake, the People's Liberation Army had the means to blow up that balloon, to take it down. They chose not to. They probably thought it was a bonus, that it traveled across the United States, that its abilities to hover over American nuclear missile and bomber bases, they were probably overjoyed. Why? Because this balloon was an inner space satellite, as Frank mentioned. It had a much more refined and ability to gather information about the weather over the American missile and bomber bases. Why is this important? Because when you fire a warhead, maneuverable warhead, especially a small warhead, or more importantly, China's new hypersonic glide vehicles, having knowledge of the weather over the target is extremely important. The weather can affect tremendously the accuracy of those warheads, especially when you're trying to hit a target as small as an ICBM silo. And this raises my second major point. The balloon, combined with already a massive Chinese surveillance satellite network, polar orbit, stationary, geostationary, deep space, early warning satellites most recently, all point to me to the beginning of a Chinese transition from doctrines of defense and deterrence to doctrines of warfighting, to include massive first strikes. And this is what we need to be aware of as we watch, as we have over the last 2 years, China's construction of 360 new ICBM silos, silos that are probably completed or very close to being completed by now, and that will be filled with new solid fuel ICBMs, some of them with versions of the Dongfeng 5 liquid fueled ICBM, probably the Dongfeng 5 Charlie that we know has been tested to carry 10 warheads. Now, the larger question is whether the solid fuel ICBMs being put in these silos will also have 10 warheads. This has been acknowledged by the recently retired director of the U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, and is a point made in numerous Chinese sources, some official, some unofficial, that were posted on the Chinese internet military chat pages until the Chinese government shut them all down about 2 years ago. Now, if you do the simple math, 360 warheads or 360 silos, 10 warheads, 3,600 warheads, and then you add the warheads that China already has deployed, 300 to 400, you're looking at totals of over 3,000 warheads. And it's my contention that China is probably aiming for totals of 3,000 to 4,000 warheads, to include probably another 6 SSBNs of the new Type 096 version that we should see being produced very soon. China has recently greatly increased its submarine production facilities at its main base at Huludao. And we were already beginning to see new versions of their attack submarines, and these usually form the basis for their new SSBNs. In addition, China probably has many hundreds to 1,000 theater nuclear warheads deployed on its over 1,000 theater ballistic missiles, and its ability to launch successive waves of about 800 land attack cruise missiles on its growing fleet of H-6K, H-6J, and November bombers. And these bombers will soon be joined by China's first flying wing stealth bomber platform, usually called the Shan H-20. Asian military sources have been telling me for almost 10 years that they expect this bomber to be in service by 2025. Seems like a reasonable guess. And on top of all of this, we have to consider, as Frank mentioned, that China and Russia have been considering joint nuclear strike strategies. This is, to me, suggested by their long cooperation in strategic defense. Russia has shared long-range early warning radar technology with China. The beginnings of ballistic missile defense, ballistic missile interceptor technology. To the degree that we are now witnessing the Chinese nuclear breakout, we could also be seeing a Chinese missile defense breakout in the next 1 to several years. All of this points to, as I mentioned earlier, toward a new Chinese posture, one dedicated to warfighting, one dedicated to maximum nuclear coercion, and if nuclear coercion does not work, then nuclear attack is one of the next options for China. And sorry to say that the Biden administration is simply not taking this on, is not responding. We should be remerving our existing land-based and sea-based missiles, and we should be working on larger land-based missiles to carry many more warheads. My vote is that we aim initially for 6,000 warheads. That's how we can deter conflict, defend our allies, and hopefully make sure that our younger generations are not being drafted and marched off to not just one war, but multiple wars that China will be fighting to impose hegemony over the earth.
Rick, thank you. A bracing report, but as always, extremely rich in content and authoritative at that. I know you have to leave, so I just wanted to put a question or two to you, if I may, before you go, and then we'll get to our other presenters and the question round with them. You speculated that the Chinese may, in fact, have been right in saying that the balloon's flight path was a mistake. You certainly indicated that they didn't do anything to prevent it from going on that path. But really, when you look at where it went, not just over those ICBM fields, but also over several other bases of interest to the Chinese in the non-nuclear space, I think it's fair to say. Do you really think that they didn't have control over where it went and how long it loitered over the
Well, Frank, it's these U.S. intelligence sources that have been quoted in several news outlets over the last 2 days that have been suggesting the Chinese made a mistake, that their balloon was mistakenly carried aloft by errant winds and made to fly over the United States. I think that's all rubbish. And
I thought so.
Some kind of just attempt to whitewash this and to make the administration's relative inaction seem more understandable, plausible, and it's all rubbish.
Right.
You know, even if the balloon was aimed at Guam and it was quote unquote mistakenly gathered up by errant winds, the Chinese gained a much larger prize, and you know, the officers in charge of letting that balloon fly over the United States have been patted on the back and have already received their rewards, in my estimation.
In China, yes, indeed. Thank you. That's very helpful, Rick, and we look forward to further visits with you in the near future. But in the meantime, this is really an important contribution to today's program. Godspeed. We're going to hear next, as Rick mentioned earlier, from Dr. Mark Schneider, another of our duty experts on the Committee for the Present Danger China. It is my privilege to have worked with Mark decades ago during the Reagan administration. He served before that and after in a number of important positions in the Defense Department, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as a Foreign Service officer at the State Department's policy planning staff, also as a professional staff member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. These days, he is a senior analyst with a terrific organization, the National Institute for Public Policy, one of the real repositories outside of government of sensible nuclear strategists and thinking about the challenges that we face in this regard. And Mark Schneider, it is always tremendously appreciated that you join us. I know you're recently recovering from COVID, and that makes all the more important this visit with you. So I know you'll stay with us as long as you can, but the floor is yours, sir. Fire for effect.
Well, thank you. Before I get into this talk, I want to point out that when the last time I was in government, which was over a decade ago, I got more intelligence from Rick Fisher, open source intelligence, than I was getting from the regular intelligence dump. So he has done an incredible amount of high quality research and analysis. Anyway, within the last year or two, a number of very high-ranking American generals have warned us about the risk that the Chinese are going to start a war over Taiwan by 2025. I accept those predictions as very likely. The Chinese are clearly exercising their capabilities against in fact, a simulated attack on Taiwan and an invasion. And they are doing just about everything they can to beef up their military capabilities very, very quickly. That includes the nuclear breakout that Rick talked about. The Chinese now have more ICBM launches than the United States. And the number of warheads being projected in the Pentagon's report for 2035, I think, is more likely to be what we see in about 2025. And that's a good part of this. Now, there is the anti-access part of it, which it's a major part of Chinese policy. They've been developing this capability for decades, and it's a very important one. They have beefed up their early warning capabilities to the point where it's now reliable, multi-tiered, and it can, even as the Pentagon report October 2022 pointed out, it can support a launch on warning attack against the United States. So we're seeing the Chinese continue to build up their active defensive capabilities. The Chinese right now have several of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. This includes the Russian SA-10, the SA-20, and the S-400. They have built, or to some extent ripped off the Russian SA-10 and SA-20 in their own indigenous HQ-9 and HQ-9B systems. They, according to the Pentagon report, they are developing the HQ-19, which the report says will have or may have, well, likely have a capability against ballistic missiles. So this is a very, very significant capability. They are also beefing up their Air Force in very, very important ways. Up until recently, it was based largely on either purchased Russian Sukhoi flanker type aircraft. They've gone beyond that now. They have their own indigenous 4.5 generation fighter, the JL-10, and more significantly, even the Pentagon report admits that the J-20 stealth fighter is now operational, and the Pentagon report says more advanced versions of it are under development. Now, in the last few months, there have been a number of press reports saying the Chinese now have on the order of 200 JL-20s. That's a very significant development in and of itself. So we need to deal with this. The Air Force has actually done more than the Navy in terms of dealing with the Chinese stealth threat. They pulled F-117s out of retirement. They've used them in exercises to give the Chinese, American pilots the experience in detecting stealth aircraft. The first of an early model version of the F-35 has now gone to an aggressor unit, and this is a major change in policy. 5 years ago, the head of the Air Combat Command said that training against the F-35 would be negative training because it has so many capabilities Chinese don't have. Well, now, obviously, an old version of the F-35 with much less capabilities than the current ones, much less the ones that are coming off the production line now, is something that we have to trade against. So we're dealing certainly with a very, very extensive and growing capability in anti-missile defense and anti-aircraft defense and anti-cruise missile defense, and even potentially hypersonic missile defense. The Russian S-400, for example, is advertised as being able to intercept hypersonic missiles. I wouldn't bet the mortgage on that one, but certainly the Chinese are going to reverse engineer the system, upgrade it in every way they can, and their version of it could very well have those capabilities. Now, China has put a lot of money in both leadership protection and civil defense. And the most important development in this area has been the superconcrete. Superconcrete, you can even buy this in the United States, by the way, is now at the level where you have 35,000 psi overpressure capability. That's almost as strong as steel. Now, in the old days when battleships shot it out, the maximum confirmed penetration where a shell actually got through an armored belt and detonated inside a ship was 9 inches. Now we're talking about the potential of Chinese facilities having the equivalent of several feet of armor, steel armor plate. That's something we've never had to deal with before. And it's potentially very significant. Now, the reduced U.S. nuclear capabilities that we've allowed to happen in the last 30 years can't possibly deal with the level of capability that the Chinese are now deploying. In terms of counterforce targeting, they now have more ICBM launchers than we do. Of all things, the Global Zero Commission had its own war plan against China, and they put 2 warheads on each Chinese silo. Now, that was when the Chinese had 20 silos. When they have over 400, you can't do this. The underground Great Wall is an example of something that's literally impossible for the U.S. to deal with the level of capabilities that we have now. The Pentagon report has largely ignored this, probably because they're embarrassed by the fact that Phil Carver and a bunch of graduate students discovered something that they didn't, or at least something that they weren't telling anyone about. So we have a situation where they built something like 5,000 kilometers of these missile tunnels, and according to Chinese press, they were 400 meters underground, which means you can't even take them out with a direct hit by any of our missile warheads. And the National Academy of Sciences analysis of this, published, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, is still very, very relevant. Now, we are in a situation where the U.S. nuclear deterrent and ability to attack hard and deeply buried targets, including the leadership facilities, is in the process of eroding by design. And that's exactly what it is. The new U.S. nuclear bomb, the B-61 Mod 12, has virtually no capabilities against hard and deeply buried targets. The maximum yield is way too low. It has no earth penetrating capability. The Biden administration just decided in the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review to eliminate the V-83 bomb. And that's the only weapon we have today which has any sort of capabilities against really deep, hard, and deeply buried targets. This is a really stupid decision, but it in many respects reflects the whole attitude they have toward nuclear deterrence. They don't like it. They want to what they say reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons. And in effect, what they are doing is reducing our ability to deter the Chinese. And the last thing I want to talk about here is a warning that Admiral Richard, who just retired as Stratcom commander, delivered just before his retirement. And what he said was, and he was talking about China, the nuclear deterrent ship is, quote, slowly sinking. And that's the best description right now of anything, of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. The modernization program, several of them won't get into production and fielding in the time period that they're supposed to. Until we get the B-21 bomber and it's nuclear capable, we will have a gradual erosion in our nuclear capabilities as far into the future as we can see, up to up to about a decade, and then things might get better. And I say might because it's not even clear that that's true. So bottom line is they're getting ready for war. They're going to get if they really attack Taiwan in 2025, and I'm willing to accept that that is reasonably likely, they will do everything they can over the next 2-3 years to get as many of these new systems operational in the field as they can. And we're, in effect, cutting defense spending. And that's really a foolish thing to do under these circumstances. Thank you.
Finally, last hardly least, is a man who's already been advertised twice now as being with us. And I'm very pleased to say that he was able to join us at the last possible moment, and I'm grateful for that. His name is Dr. Philip Carber. He has an extraordinary record of service to our country, both in government and in the defense sector of the contracting community. He has been a very, very influential professor in a number of our academic institutions, including my alma mater, Georgetown University, where he actually led this extraordinarily important forensic analysis of open source information that gave rise to insights into the great underground wall of China that Mark described. Perhaps he'll tell us a little bit about that, as how it fits into the doctrine of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to nuclear warfighting, which is the topic we've asked him to address. Dr. Carber is also a member, as is Mark, of our Committee on the Present Danger China. We're very proud of these extraordinary talents and very privileged to be able to present them to you. Dr. Carber, over to you, sir, for talking about doctrine. What's the Chinese thinking on all of this?
It's a great pleasure to be with my two colleagues. Mark and I, both from having gone to school in Los Angeles, came to Washington, or started working with Washington, with the ranking minority member for the old Congressional Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, and Craig Hosmer. And Mark and I have been friends ever since, and I have the highest respect for his analysis. And Rick, obviously, we've been very close. I remember a couple years ago, Rick sharing with me, he just briefly mentioned his analysis of a Chinese web-based commentary, and it was generally poo-pooed, but in that, if I remember right, they were talking about several thousand ICBM warheads being fired, carrying the DF-41. And their own kind of equivalent of the original U.S. Minuteman force, which was supposed to be 2,000. And at the time, there were very few people who paid attention. Well, it proved to be incredibly accurate, and Rick is always on the forefront of this. I think it's important. There's a shibboleth that we all kind of grew up with, and it's popular, worst case analysis. But I think what we're really experiencing over the last 30 years is a dangerous best case analysis. And part of it is our attitude towards China. We were hoping that there was a basic attitude as they became more economically prosperous and economically dependent on trade and so forth with the rest of the world. They would likewise adopt liberal attitudes and generally join the international system and have play a part in the commons and eventually arms control. There was also, because they had a philosophy that went for almost 60 years, which was go talk very, particularly after Mao's demise, but talk very quietly and build strength, and don't raise issues, don't cause problems, and sort of appear to be pretty benign. And that changed in 2009 when they said, okay, we've had our period of building, and now we have our period of exercising the strength that we have built, or as that strength comes online. And one of those areas of critical importance to them is their sphere of influence in Asia, and they view the United States as a roadblock. You know, they believe that they should be the 800-pound gorilla in Asia, and that those on the periphery with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, Korea, Philippines, Singapore, ought to be appreciative of their superiority and good vassals, and they can all get along. And the United States does not have a right to be there to try and defend these guys. I remember with Secretary Carlucci had been a member of the United Nations four power talks, which include Russia, China, Japan, at the end of the Cold War. And I remember three Chinese four-star vice chief PLA saying, you know, you had nuclear weapons at one point in Taiwan. You had nuclear weapons in the Philippines. You had nuclear capable bombers in Thailand. You had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. You had a couple carriers off our shore. You left. You're not coming back. And I think there is a sort of attitude that their growing strength is essentially to enforce their right of eminent domain in Eastern Eastern Asia. If one looks at their and how we miss that is because their force quantity was relatively small. There was an assumption, not based on actual doctrine or availability of text, but assumption of a concept of minimum deterrence, that they had just enough to cause a little bit of damage, and hopefully that would be enough to keep us from starting something with them, and that they really didn't have an intent to have a larger force posture. There was also an issue with respect to their nuclear weapons program. The Chinese had this very dynamic testing program with a large number of atmospheric tests from relatively low yield to high yield, and then a number of underground tests. They built, and the majority of those tests, in fact, all but one of them, were done by tactical and strategic bombers, delivered by tactical and strategic bombers. Then they had an underground test with as low as sub-kiloton yields, testing what would be a tactical, and they admitted in 1995 that they had tested and had the capability to have an enhanced radiation warhead. But the assumption was that they were fissile limited, that they had limited themselves to production of fissile material. So even though they had this robust nuclear test program with a wide range of warheads, it actually only had less than 100 fielded and did not have enough fissile material to add more. And they kept in that posture. The assumption was they kept in that posture for 40 years. I mean, there was an analyst recently when they were showing up those silos who said, well, there really aren't nuclear weapons in those silos because they don't have the fissile material. They're just penetration aids for the few that they do have. But there hasn't been an effort to go back and say, wait a minute, boy, we really missed this one. Oh, well, we assumed that they didn't have, that their tactical and bomber force was basically non-nuclear. No. It is increasingly evident that they do have a nuclear role. The Chinese have a Russian, and they're in a way somewhat waiting because they've built a large force of short range, medium, intermediate forces, some of which are clearly dedicated to nuclear, and some of which appear to have, at least initially, a conventional capability. But we tend to miss two key elements of that. One is they're big on reloads. We've now had a new appreciation of what reloads really mean, in that we grossly underestimate, I mean by a factor of 10, the number of tactical and theater ballistic missiles the Russians were firing or could fire against Ukraine, because they had a large number of reloads. And the Chinese also believe in large reloads. Secondly, there's no reason why a system that is conventional at one point can't have a nuclear capability added to it. We did it repeatedly with a whole range of tactical systems that were deployed in Europe. Likewise, the Chinese have submarine torpedoes from Russia that in Russia are nuclear capable. They have surface ships, missiles on their ships from Russia or indigenous that could carry a nuclear weapon. The S-400, according to Russian discussions, has a nuclear capability in Russia. When I talked to some Russians, they admitted that some of the fighter aircraft they sold China were, in fact, had the same wiring as theirs did for release of nuclear weapons. So I'm not saying that they have all of those capabilities, but that they are certainly within reach. So what does that mean doctrinally? Look, if you'd show up the first slide for me, I'd like to just highlight it for a second. So if you look at their published writings, and I'm talking about writings for themselves, not ones that were designed for external release. The Chinese have sort of multiple levels of analysis. They have their strategic level, and then below that are campaigns for theater campaigns, and then underneath campaigns there would be various types of operations. So they organize their whole construct around the concept of campaigns. Traditionally, they had a set of conventional missile strike campaigns and then a subset of nuclear. Now, what's interesting is that the range of conventional ones have now been moved into a dual capable deal. So you can have a dual capable, either conventional or nuclear or simultaneously, a missile deterrent operation, a firepower destruction, blockade, maneuver, harassing attacks, and so forth. It's interesting that their concept of deterrence, going literally to the characters that they use for it, does not connote our sense of a passive reaction. It is overt coercion. So they would argue that when we, quote, say we have a deterrent strategy, they view it as a coercive deterrent, coercive pressure strategy, which they resent and have been trying to develop an antidote to. So they have this set of operations. One of their concerns was their vulnerability. As Mark referenced, they started building a wide range of tunnels, starting in the 60s, and also started working on civil defense for their cities, including Beijing, which had a massive complex underneath it at one point. But while the city civil defense program went into recession, if you will, only to be brought back more recently as kind of as developers build their skyscraper, they're required by various zoning law to put the civil defense aspects in. So they started putting their forces in these tunnels. So the question then was, how do you operate these? And they developed a term called mobile expansion. That mobile expansion is the process by which a series of actions they take coming out of the tunnels. And they have built that. That isn't a one-time event. That is a series or process. So some of the tunnels that they've been building are absolutely massive. As Mark said, in 2009, they referenced that they had 5,000 kilometers. By the way, they have continued to build more tunnels and bigger tunnels, including now tunnels for their strategic bombers. One base recently revitalized, spent 10 years revitalizing it with a massive underground complex to handle their strategic bomber. But you see the sheer size of this particular tunnel. If you look at it, you could actually have 3 lighter ICBMs, the F-31, the heavy 41s trailer-mounted cells, or even the train version of the DF-41. Any combination of those sitting astride. And so what's interesting is they put this big effort into the tunnels, and they have this construct of how do you use that tunnel-based force for your coercive strategy. Look at a process from left to right. peacetime, then you have increasing crisis all the way up to war, and then even nuclear war. And you say, well, where do the tunnels fit in this? Well, in peacetime, as the quote said, if you had a chance to read it, is in peacetime that only a minimum amount of the force is actually exposed on bases outside, and they have a substantial capability that is inside the tunnel complex, and then it conveys a minimalist posture. When a crisis happens, and this is really deal, they have a whole construct where you literally flood out, and you have these missile forces pre-designated going out to firing positions in a very rapid to impress whoever you're having a coercive conflict with before it becomes lethal. And these forces are moving around. They're highly mobile, and they can go from one tunnel complex to another. Now, when, for example, if it starts conventionally, they can come out of the tunnels, fire conventional rounds, and then go back in the tunnels and rearm, and including rearm with a dual capable, the missiles are dual capable, can rearm with a nuclear warhead. And then take the next step. Oh, yes, well, now we have even a more robust nuclear campaign. So what's interesting about it is how this all fits then into their strategy. So if you sort of look at it historically, in the 90s, the U.S. had, in the 70s, the U.S. had superiority all across the spectrum. The Chinese have been building up in their conventional capability for local conflict, what they call local wars, and more recently, the last 20 years, they've been focused on theater war, including creating a whole new system of theater commands. But in the higher end side, they had not put as much emphasis on the strategic, which we now see they are. So the interesting question is, are they really thinking about waging a intercontinental strategic war, or how does it fit in to their overall theater strategy of being able to assert greater dominance and position in theater? And I'll explain why in a minute, but my own belief is that they're playing outside of the red box. The role of the forces in the red box is to keep us inhibited from either intervening or trying to use a conventional force or a nuclear force. It was interesting. A Chinese general was interviewed during the Taiwan election crisis of 1995-96, when the Chinese actually fired DF-15 missiles at the port, next to the ports on both the north and south side of Taiwan. It's a coercive element, quote, for tests. And at the same time, we were sending fleets, and there was a lot of action back and forth. But this general made the comment that their objective, they admitted that in a war, they would be willing to lose all the cities east of Xi'an, which also happens to be the headquarters of the Strategic Rocket Forces. If you look at it, it's truly amazing. Now, why they would consider that in terms of why they would think our strikes would necessarily be limited just to that area rather than all of China and so forth. But it's an interesting claim. I did a little bit of analysis that was kind of, people use the term existential threat. A dirty bomb is an existential threat. Yeah, it's an existential threat to people who happen to be within its limited range. A single nuclear weapon is an existential threat to a city. But when we're talking about existential threat to a country, we're talking about hundreds of nuclear weapons and 100 at least targets. Just if one looks at the top 100 cities between Russia, China, and the U.S., you get sort of an interesting set of dynamics. We have 133 cities of 100,000 people or more, and that represents 61 million people, or roughly 20% of our population. I'm sorry, that's Russia. U.S. has 331 cities, which represent 65 million people, or about 20%. So it's the Russian. I'm sorry, I got the numbers back. The Russians are 45% of their population in 61, representing 61 million people in 133 cities. The U.S. is 20% of our population in 331. The Chinese have 1,442 cities of 100,000 or more, which represents, and it has a population of 300 million, or 20% of the population. So if one is thinking about waging nuclear war, there is in some ways a similarity and some ways a differential between the three players. The point is that the more one looks at that, the less interesting it is in terms of a use of those forces. Threatening, yes. Having ran the Proud Prophet exercise, which was the only exercise the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of Defense ever did, were personally playing out the entire U.S. war plan all the way to thermonuclear war, full-scale thermonuclear war. I had a new appreciation of the impact of escalation. And anybody who thinks that a few necessarily are going to limit it is probably making a big mistake. Nonetheless, it is a very attractive option. So I think if you look at the buildup that the Chinese are having, and you say, what do they get out of could they possibly do a first strike against the United States? Yeah. At some point in a few years, so whether it's 25 or 35, that ends up being a really important point. But if we're smart, that's reasonably handleable. Okay? That we know how to do. We build more stuff, we put more active defenses in. If they're willing to play that nuclear coercion game in the theater, remember, we got rid of all of our tactical nuclear weapons in the early 90s because we wanted to set an example for China, and we were hoping Russia would get rid of. We got rid of everything except for 300 or 400 B-61 bombs, which both Rick and Mark have referenced. The Russians kept a couple thousand, and the Chinese are on control. So there's a serious gap in the tactical and theater posture in Asia, and that we do not have a ready. It's not just a matter of spending more money or turning the crank. It's going to take a redesign of our forces. And Frank, I'm sorry I went too long.
No, this was great, Phil, and I'm so glad you were able to participate in the program, and you've made a really important contribution to it in a number of respects. Let me just take a minute or two to round this up a little bit, and also talk about, if as seems, I think, patently to be the case, the Chinese Communist Party does believe it can fight and win a nuclear war. As you say, Phil, perhaps not quite yet, but shortly. And I think, as Mark has very helpfully pointed out, in addition to the immense numbers, it seems, of nuclear weapons they are deploying, the various steps that they have taken to protect themselves, their populations, even on that part of the country that they seem prepared to write off, at least a few years ago, to defend and otherwise minimize the damage we could inflict in a presumably second strike against them. So if you're dealing with people, and unfortunately I fear that Vladimir Putin is of a same mind in terms of the absolute doability of nuclear warfighting, and similarly has invested immensely, as Mark Schneider can attest. He's taught me all I know about the subject, but the buildup by the Russians of their nuclear forces, completing, I think, more or less now, a wholesale modernization of every aspect of their strategic triad, and I think lots of their theater forces as well. think the last time we talked, Mark, there were something like 22 different new nuclear systems that have been deployed by the Russians in the course of this modernization. So the idea that these two adversaries of ours might partner up, and I think mention was made that they have thought about strategic cooperation. I believe they've actually exercised strategic attacks against the United States with their nuclear forces complementing one another. So all of this is what we have to face in terms of a challenge to our ability to deter such attacks. And just a couple of things that occur to me that I think ought to be on the table as we discuss whether we can, if we're not absolutely serious that nuclear wars can be fought and won, and we are not prepared to try to make that so on our side, then we, I think, certainly leave ourselves prey to what they have in mind. The point being that we clearly need to modernize our nuclear deterrent. It is a little known fact, and I think a scandal, frankly, of the first order, that we have essentially the same forces, smaller numbers of them, to be sure, but essentially the same numbers that we had when I was in the Pentagon over 35 years ago. In fact, most of the modernization that we did under the Reagan buildup is what we've been living off of ever since. All of those forces are long past their design shelf life, and yet we continue relying on them. We continue in many ways to try to make sure that they are still credible, but I think they are obsolescent at the best. And the capacity to replace those is exceedingly limited. The defense industrial base has been among the things that has been very badly allowed to atrophy, as have these forces as well. So point one is we've got to get serious about nuclear weapons again on our side. I believe that it also behooves us to do nuclear testing again, something we have not done since 1992. And our experts can speak to this better than I. I think there's reason to believe that the Russians and Chinese, as well as others, obviously, have continued to do at least low-yield experiments that validate the nuclear forces that they have been putting into place. I want to emphasize the importance of defense. If you're thinking about deterring adversaries who take this business very seriously, we have to completely revisit policies that I believe flowed from a terribly benighted decision, going back to Richard Nixon's time, Henry Kissinger's machinations, the so-called anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1972 specifically. This was a treaty that essentially foreclosed the United States from having a viable national capability to defend our people and country against missile attack. And I think it flowed from that we decided, well, if we're not going to defend against that threat, other than through the so-called mutual assured destruction strategy, they'll be able to destroy us, we'll be able to destroy them. Everybody understands that, so nobody will do it. We decided that we would not spend the money necessary to really maintain effective air defenses or leadership defenses or civil defenses, as well as, of course, missile defenses. All of that was sort of over the side. And we've left ourselves, therefore, exceedingly vulnerable to the sorts of weaponry that we've just been hearing about. I would simply say that in addition to modernizing our strategic forces and obviously reconstituting our theater nuclear forces, mention was just made of how severely those have been reduced, we also must get serious about having missile defenses, most obviously where they will do the most good, in space. This will take a sea change in thinking, to say nothing of a very considerable investment of resources, all of which begs the question, do we have the time, given the schedule that we may be seeing shape up on the part of our adversaries. The other thing I would strongly recommend is the power of prayer. We certainly need God's grace in this moment and those that are now in prospect. With that, let me turn to some questions for these extraordinary experts. And I see Rick Fisher is still with us, I think. If you returned or you gave the dentist the miss, we're glad to have you with us, Rick. Let me start by asking the question of numbers. Rick, you followed this very closely, and I think you've given us some much more accurate estimates of what is likely to be turning up in the Chinese arsenal. And yet we still hear from some in the arms control community, so-called experts, that, oh, no, the Chinese are still maintaining, along the lines of what Phil talked about, minimal deterrence, maybe 400 weapons, maybe it'll go up a little bit, but nothing like the numbers that you're talking about. Your thoughts on that proposition?
360 silos, ICBMs capable of carrying 10 warheads. How quickly can they fill those silos? Well, last week we saw the North Korean solid fuel ICBM sitting on a China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, CASIC, 18-wheel truck. In order to build the truck to carry that missile, CASIC has to have intimate knowledge of the missile. And lo and behold, CASIC now makes a DF-41 size solid fuel space launch vehicle called the KZ-11. It's weighs about 2 tons less than a DF-41, according to open sources. It could probably carry 10 warheads as well. So China has 2 factories that could be belting out solid fuel 10 warhead capable ICBMs. So it could fill those 360 silos very quickly. And I especially commend Phil Carver's comment about reloads. China does believe in reloads. It's been stocking up reloads for all of its theater systems for 2 decades. And why wouldn't China have reloads for its ICBM silos? If we make the choice not to attack those silos, I think we have to expect that the PLA will have reloads to put in them. So 3,000, 4,000 warheads may be a low number. And yes, the fissile material argument has been around for a long time. Chinese commentators who enter into our commentariat system like to stress this point as well. But we're also seeing from revelations that started under the Trump administration that China is doing something about this. They are building new reactors capable of producing highly enriched uranium, plutonium, and who knows what they've had underground for decades. They could already have a significant nuclear warhead production capability, and they may already have stockpiles of several thousand warheads or more already, as far as we know. The Chinese just don't believe in transparency, especially nuclear transparency, and simply do not want to talk to Americans about any kind of nuclear arms control that would control their weapons. So they don't reveal what they have. They put so much of what they have underground, and they don't want to talk to us. They don't want to answer our questions. Where does that leave us? As you said, Frank, we should have been building up a long time ago, and it's becoming soon overdue for us to be able to build up to where we should be. At a minimum, if we have warheads, we should be putting them back on our Minutemen and ICBMs and Trident SLBMs. We could do that fairly rapidly. That would buy us some time. But as Phil emphasized, we're reaching a tipping point where the Chinese believe that their strategic superiority, their theater superiority in both nuclear and conventional, is going to give them a free hand in terms of coercing the United States from defending its interests, capitulating, and ushering in a very dark era of Chinese Communist Party hegemony.
Let me just come to Mark. When you and I worked in the Pentagon, I remember vividly making a trip to CCP, which I think stood for something like the Swedish Institute for Political Research or something, strategic, somewhere is in there. But the point is that they were very, very concerned at the time about Ronald Reagan's nuclear buildup. And one of the things you helped me put together was a powerful briefing based on open source information, but informed by your insights for sure, that the Soviets had actually violated the anti-ballistic missile treaty massively and built out a very comprehensive missile defense system, aircraft as well as missile defenses. Is that, you mentioned that there's been technology transfer, that the Chinese have reverse engineered such of the stuff as the Soviets and Russians have given them. Do you believe that the Chinese have in place today a very similar kind of national missile defense and air defense capability, Mark?
Well, they clearly have in place a capability of very good against bombers and cruise missiles. They have varying degrees of missile defense capability in every system, every SAM system they have. The latest ones, in particular, what's HQ-19 has the potential to go against ICBMs. They've tested in 2021, they tested a mid-course hit-to-kill interceptor. So yes, they have some degree of missile defense capability right now, but not yet a really serious level against ICBMs and SLBMs. Give them a few years, and I think that will be the case. They will do everything in their power to give themselves at least some ability to intercept ballistic missiles. Now, they've already built major elements of potentially a nationwide system. They've got space-based IR satellites that are part of their early warning system. They built a large phase array radars you can integrate without any. That's one of the purposes of these systems. You can integrate this into a ballistic missile defense capability. There's a report that I think was the HQ-26 or something like that, that they're building a SM-3 class exo-atmospheric interceptor, and of course the SM-3 recently intercepted a ICBM warhead. So, you know, I don't think they've got much right now at the strategic level, but given a few years, I think that will rapidly change. And certainly by the end of this decade, if we're lucky enough to get that far without a big fight with them, that will change. Yeah. As I said, I could find no evidence at all that the Navy has put any countermeasures on Trident. The Minuteman has countermeasures, but it's against 1960 vintage Russian ABM systems. The Air Force has said that it's going to put countermeasures on the Sentinel, but the Sentinel, I believe the IOC date now is 2029. So it's not a player in any of this near-term
stuff. Yeah. Phil Carver, to you, this question of the commitment of the Chinese to leadership and civil defense as well. Again, I think bespeaks this idea that they will be able to survive at least parts of the population, the party, the key cadre, the presumably parts of their workforce. Could you talk a little bit about what you think is the case today, whether it's in Beijing or whether it's in the underground Great Wall, that would give them confidence that, in fact, and civil defenses more broadly, that if not with complete impunity, writing off maybe hundreds of millions of their citizenry, but still they would be able to prevail in a nuclear war?
I don't want to leave the impression that I was dismissing the danger of a Chinese attempted first strike. I personally believe that it's delusional. If we have any wits about us at all, maybe we don't, and both Rick and Mark could raise some serious questions about whether our past behavior has been or insights has reflected a willingness to actually stay competitive. In my opinion, you cannot win a nuclear war in terms of what the relative payoff is versus the cost. However, you can lose a strategic nuclear war. And the way you lose it is giving the other side the impression that he can win it, whether he can or not. So if he thinks that he can save a substantial part of his population, and it is worth going all the way up and hitting the U.S., which has a counter-strike back. And by the way, we do not have a counter-value strategy. Contrary to most people's opinion, we are going after military targets. Nonetheless, many of those targets are in ports and big military fields and so forth, are in urban areas. So I think there is this serious danger. You can lose a strategic nuclear war by giving the impression to the opponent that he can win it. They have to, now to specifically your question, in terms of population, they emphasize a certain degree of civil defense. They have a number of cities. There was one city down in the south, I know it was one of them, that large city, several 100,000 people, and they have 15, 20 kilometers worth of tunnels radiating out from the city. And they ran an exercise where they evacuated, 50, 70,000 people in an hour or something out into the countryside. So they have, some cities have plans. And as I said, when they're doing modernization of big cities, they now make it a requirement as part of like the construction code that a building have civil defense facilities underneath it. Still, I think and if you look at the concentration of that population, even if we're trying to be very focused on military targets, the costs are going to be phenomenal to them. So, and not to mention the residual radiation from it, particularly if you're engaging, doing ground attack, ground burst on ICBM silos. So, yes, I think they have a program. They may convince themselves of it. I'm careful about the word delusional now, because I used to say Putin would be delusional in attacking Ukraine, but delusion happens.
Yeah, it does, and miscalculations as well.
It does not help if you think that the person who's suffering from delusion thinks that he can get away with it.
Exactly, that's your key point, I think. Before I let you go on that, Phil, you mentioned radiation. Several of our audience members, and we've had a very active contribution from those who've been watching, and I'm grateful for that, have raised this question of whether or not, as I think it was General Chi Hao Chen said back in, 2002, 2003, then the defense minister of China in a closed meeting of party cadre, that, we're not going to want to destroy the United States because we want to occupy it. Therefore, he was basically saying we're going to use biological weapons to wipe out the population, but leave intact pretty much the infrastructure that could then support the Chinese colonizers. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a factor that lends itself to this idea that they're really interested in coercion, not actual war fighting?
The biologicals is an embarrassment because I wrote a piece on the Nixon biological program in 19...
Meaning his termination of it?
Yeah, in 1970. And I thought it was a good idea at the time because I said, well, you could use nuclear weapons as the deterrent for that. And after Wuhan, I missed that one by a...
Not so much.
I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but Wuhan was a biological warfare laboratory. It was known that before this event. Why we were actually subsidizing some of their work is beyond me. And maybe.
Well, Phil, on that point, if I may, we did a book out of the Committee on the Present Danger of China and the Center for Security Policy called "The CCP is at War with America," which is available, by the way, for free as a PDF, folks. It's ccpatwar.com. It made the point that whether it intentionally got out of the lab or otherwise, it was intentionally sent here by the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore makes it not just a biological weapons lab product, but also a biological weapons attack in our estimation.
But it did kind of rebound back. There was a little bit of a blowback to last year.
Yeah.
But before we leave this topic, I'd like to raise the issue of EMP.
I was going to come to that next, as a matter of fact.
The
Go ahead.
balloon, you know, I'd be interested in Mark and Rick's thing, but whatever's on those balloons right now, I kind of wonder whether they wouldn't be a interesting. I used to think that the best way to do a precursor attack would be to do a fractional orbital bombardment coming in from the backside with some EMP bursts just to basically suppress the initial reaction until the killers come in. But it'd be interesting whether, you know, given the size, if you can carry a freaking bus on this balloon, you can carry a hell of a EMP warhead.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting. I was going to go to Rick on that precise point. When he was with us last week, Rick, you talked about this surveillance platform being something that they might find useful in the event that satellites were not available. And I immediately thought that, you know, that's because if they did use an electromagnetic pulse to attack this country, it would blind a lot of satellites, including theirs. Do you want to talk a little bit about the EMP threat?
It's real, and we should expect it from North Korea as well, on missiles especially. But there are some who contend that at 66,000 feet, where the most recent balloon was hovering, that may be too low to effectively get what they might be seeking from an EMP strike. Yes, it will cause damage under that zone, but the balloon, if it's much higher, closer to a low Earth orbit, 100 kilometers plus, it would have a much more desired effect. But yeah, the balloon is a potential war-fighting enabler after a space war wipes out most of what's in low Earth orbit. And the Chinese ability to, you know, they've been practicing this for a decade now, sending scores of balloons everywhere. Yeah, if they could put up 1,000 balloons such as this, they would have constant coverage. They could dole out satellite-like connectivity to their allies and followers, and further isolate the United States and other democracies, as well as conduct surveillance, targeting, warfighting, damage assessment.
This is really vital, and I appreciate so much you making the point. For those of you listening and unfamiliar with the electromagnetic pulse problem, we've been talking about it at our Center for Security Policy for 20 years or so, in connection specifically with the vulnerability of our electric grid. Military assets have supposedly been pretty much hardened against this stuff, but the dirty little secret is our military bases, certainly in the United States, depend critically upon the electricity from the civilian grid, as does, of course, the society writ large. There's a terrific new film I want to commend to all of you called Grid Down, Power Up. You can find it at griddownpowerup.com. You can see it there, and I encourage you to take a look at it and also to take the actions that are suggested to get in touch with your elected representatives to take steps. I should have mentioned them in my quick summary there of what we need to do to harden our grid. The good news being that there's now $1.2 trillion that has been authorized and appropriated by Congress for the purposes of improving our infrastructure. There's a lot of needs there, but among them, I think the most acute is perhaps making our grid more resilient against these sorts of threats and reducing their danger. Mark Schneider, last question to you. It turns out the SIPRI stands for the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I got it rather badly mangled there. They did not like our presentation, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, I would think so.
You were very helpful in putting it together. And I just wanted to say, to what extent, having studied kind of the mindset as well as the capabilities of these adversaries, do you think that the fact that they have taken these steps, this combination of enormous buildups of offensive power, as well as means of protecting things they care about? I don't think it's necessarily all of the people of China, but certainly not the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or the Southern Mongolians, but even the Han people of China, I guess in part too. But does it give rise, going back to Phil Carber's point, does it give rise to a possible misplaced, but nonetheless confidence on their part that they could win? We certainly could lose, at least, a nuclear war.
Well, one of the biggest problems we have is the legacy of Maoist nuclear fanaticism. The argument, and I mean, this was out of the mouths of the most senior generals in the 1950s and onward, that, okay, it's no big deal. We lose a few 100 million people. There's still a few 100 million Chinese left. Now, in the 21st century, you can still find Chinese generals saying things more or less like that. So that's I think, a very serious problem. I don't believe they want to use nuclear weapons, but they want to win. And if it's a choice between initiating nuclear weapons use and losing or not winning, I think that's what they're going to do. Now, if you take a look at the October 22 Pentagon report on China, the math and the numbers, I think, are ridiculous in terms of the pace of the Chinese buildup. But the one good thing in the report is that they are now crediting China with having a nuclear doctrine, or at least probably having a nuclear doctrine, very similar to Putin. And the most interesting thing about that is that if you go to paragraph 19 of Putin's June 2020 nuclear decree, and you go to the Pentagon's report, of the 4 circumstances for first use of nuclear weapons, 3 of them are in the Pentagon report with the word probably before them. So this is a drastic change in terms of the assessment of the probability that these guys would use nuclear weapons first in a conflict. Now, I'm virtually certain that the United States won't. That in this administration, I think it's more of a question of would they actually retaliate in kind, or would they try to fight a conventional war after nuclear weapons use? If we did something that's silly, we're going to lose. There's no question about that.
Well, there's yet another possibility, which is simply surrendering, which I don't think can be ruled out by this administration at all. Again, another source of potential calculation or miscalculation. Let me say thank you to each of our panelists. This has been a really bracing, shall we say, presentation by each of you. And I want to thank especially the hard work and expertise and deep knowledge that you've brought to bear for the benefit of our audience, both those watching at the moment and those who will presumably and hopefully see this program in the days to come, especially if all of you out there will do your job and help pass it along to friends and colleagues and others in your circles of influence. Let me just close on my own part by saying one of the things that I wanted to call your attention to, we just unveiled it on Steve Bannon's War Room program this morning, is that with the help of my colleague Didi Laugesen and many in our committee, we have just put the finishing touches on a new book, which is entitled The Indictment: Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party for their war crimes against America and other crimes against humanity. This is an effort to take essentially the most important insights and quotes and other content from as many of these 70 or so webinars as we've been able to pull together, to provide it in a form of 9 discrete charges that can be, well, as I say, prosecuted at least in the court of public opinion against the Chinese Communist Party. And to do so in a way that will both help the committees in the Congress that are now looking into all of this and make more streamlined and effective their investigations, and most especially, I hope, their specific concrete actions that have to be taken now, both in this area that we've been discussing today, deterring war, nuclear and otherwise, of the kinetic kind from the Chinese Communist Party, and also bringing to an end the kind of unrestricted, or if you will, pre-kinetic warfare that the Chinese communists have been waging against us for decades. The book will have, in addition to the 9 charges, some 20 discrete recommendations for those actions, as well as some thoughts about how they can most effectively be, well, actualized. I commend it to you. We should have it available for pre-order soon, but it is a coming attraction at the moment. We hope to unveil it. Steve Bannon indicated he was going to make a point of it at the upcoming CPAC meeting here in the Washington area. If you haven't already signed up, I know Steve has a discount on participating in it. We'll be there with a lot of others, and I very much hope that others of you in our audience will as well. In the meantime, let me simply say thank you to those of you who are faithfully following these webinars. I hope you are finding them useful and that you are indeed passing them along. So once again, our thanks to Richard Fisher, Dr. Mark Schneider, Dr. Phil Carver, and of course to all of you for being with us today. And with that, Didi Laugesen, back to you.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks to all of our panelists, and most especially thank you to our audience for being here today. A video of this webinar will post to presentdangerchina.org within a day of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. Join us again next week for our next installment of the Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the USA is betrayed by CCP-captured elites. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.